the Menendez brothers. The trial ended with 2 deadlocked juries, causing the boys to be retried, but during the second trial, the judge didn't allow the boys to use the sexual abuse as a defense. Both brothers were convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, with both of them receiving life sentences and no possibility of parole. They then didn't see one another for 22 years. Until 2018, they were housed in the same unit, and when they met, they embraced and burst into tears. The child psychologist that works with the brothers claims that the boys are innocent and their father was in fact a monster. A cousin of the boys also states that he remembers Lyle telling him during his childhood that his father was doing things to him that no parent should ever do. Others believe, however, that the boys are simply using any excuse they can, given that they are actually held accountable for their crimes. But ultimately, it's up to you to decide the innocence of...
In 2018, a 51-year-old woman drove her car onto a Little League field. Attempting to stop the woman and keep the children safe, 68-year-old Douglas Parkhurst jumps in front of the car and tries to close the gate. He succeeded keeping everyone safe, but sadly died from his injuries on the way to the hospital. Carol Sharrow is arrested, and the story should end there. But it doesn't. On Halloween night in 1968, 4-year-old Carol Lee Ashby was trick-or-treating with her older sister. Tragically, 4-year-old Carol Lee was hit and killed by a drunk driver, and the case remained cold for 45 years, until 2013 when Douglas Parkhurst confessed to being her killer. After 45 years, the statute of limitations had run out, and Douglas faced no punishment. When interviewed in 2018, Carol Lee's older sister Darlene said, "It's like a complete circle now. He went out the same way he took my sister out."
Terrible crimes that were solved by pure coincidence. On April 28, 1997, Zephanie Nurse was born, and she was placed in a nearby crib while her mother Celeste slept, but when Celeste awoke, her daughter was missing. Police searched the hospital, but nothing of note was found. In fact, no progress was made in the case for nearly 2 decades. However, when Celeste's next oldest daughter Cassidy started classes at a new school in 2014, she met Michelle Solomon. The girls quickly struck up a close friendship, and many people commented on the resemblance to one another. So much so that when Cassidy introduced Michelle to her mom Celeste, she instantly contacted the police. When Michelle's alleged parents couldn't provide proof of her birth, a DNA test was conducted and it was confirmed that Michelle was actually Zephanie Nurse, Celeste's missing daughter. The kidnapper LaVonna Solomon was later convicted in the abduction case and sentenced to 10 years in prison.
This case's twist will shock you. On the evening of 2014, Sarah Sands had downed 2 bottles of wine, put on a hoodie, and left her apartment carrying a knife. She then walked to a 77-year-old man's house named Michael Plested and took his life. She then walked back to her house and gave herself up to the police. But why did she do it? Turns out that man's name wasn't Michael Plested. He had legally changed it through a secret loophole in the law, which allows you to do so when applying for a new passport, because he was actually on the SO list for messing with children. And it turns out he had lured her 3 sons into his apartment, 12-year-old Bradley and the 11-year-old twins Alfie and Reese, and essayed them. In court, Sarah claimed that she will never be able to take the nightmares that happen to her boys away from them when they're screaming at night. She got 7.5 years, and now that she's out, she fights the law, campaigning to stop other offenders from changing their name through that same loophole. Did you see the secret question I hid in this video?
A family in New Zealand found human remains inside of a storage locker they won through an auction. It's typical for storage units to be put up for auction if they have been unclaimed and unused for many years. This New Zealand family won a specific storage locker and they were emptying it out, found some suitcases. Upon realizing that the suitcases smelled terrible, they opened them up and found decomposing bodies. These bodies were later identified to be 2 children, one 5 years old and the other about 10 years old. While we don't know how long they were in the storage locker, it does seem like they had been there for a good amount of time. The only lead right now is police think that the children's mother is living in South Korea and she arrived there in 2018. Other than that, we don't really know much about this case yet.
Remember when Terrifier 2 made people pass out and throw up in theaters? Well, get ready because Terrifier 3 was just officially confirmed and it's going to be even bloodier. I have no idea how they're going to top the bedroom scene, but I'm excited to find out. Allegedly, the actors for Art the Clown and Sienna are both returning, so I feel like this means Terrifier 3 will be continuing the story from right after Terrifier 2. One of the producers said they'll have a bigger budget intended on giving filmmakers more creative freedom. and let them be as wild as they can be. And all jokes aside, we're going for that Oscar this year. Can you imagine if Terrifier 3 wins an Oscar? I'll be updating you guys with anything I find out, so follow for more.
Killed by her childhood best friend in 2016. At the time of her death, Sarah was living with her dad in Neptune City, New Jersey, and studying arts and media at their local community college. As many of her friends knew, she'd recently received a lot of money following her mom's passing. It was the middle of the night on December 2nd when Sarah's car was found abandoned on a nearby bridge with the engine still running. Dive team searched the water thinking that she may have jumped, but ultimately they came up with nothing. Sarah's case was investigated as a missing persons investigation until January of 2017, when another student came forward and pointed authorities in the direction of her junior year prom date, 19-year-old Liam McAtanzi. The two had been friends for over 10 years. On January 31st, police set the student up with microphones and cameras and had him meet Liam in a local parking lot. There, he confessed to everything, explaining that he and his best friend Preston spent 6 months planning Sarah's murder. Yes, this is a photo of Sarah, Liam, and Preston together at their high school prom. The plan was for Liam to go to Sarah's house, get her drunk, and then take her for everything her mom had left her. On December 1st, he did exactly this and strangled Sarah for 30 minutes before hiding her body in the bushes outside of her house. Later that night, he came back with Preston, and the two drove her and her vehicle to the nearby bridge. There, they threw her off and then staged the scene to make it look like a suicide. Liam and Preston thought Sarah had nearly $100,000, but they only walked away with $8,000. Liam has since been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and Preston to 18 years. Sarah's body has never been found, as it likely drifted off to sea within 24 hours.
The Florida Man. A national treasure of sorts, both a nightmare and a cause of intrigue for millions. Florida man in facing attack believes he was half man, half dog. Florida man arrested for throwing a gator into a Wendy's. Florida man destroys nest full of wasps with his bare hands. Now, who is the Florida Man? I mean, you and I both know that it's multiple people doing insane things in the real-life GTA server that is Florida, but the legend still remains. One man doing things none of us could fathom. The Florida Man. It's become a fun game for people to look up the phrase Florida Man followed by their birthday to see what crazy things the Florida Man did that day. For me, I was born on January 14th, and what comes up is kill him with kindness. Florida Man kills someone with a machete named Kindness. You never know what you could find. What is going on down there in Florida? And how has it gone on for this long? All the answers we may never have. But all of that is part of the mystery of...
This daycare worker is why many Americans choose to not send their kids to daycare. Hi, my name is Ethan, and trigger warning, this is a dark case. In June of 2018, a 1-year-old in Jessica Cherry's care allegedly fell from a chair, hit her head, and suffered extensive bruising and skull fracture. Fast forward 2 years later, another 2-year-old was found deceased in Jessica's playpen in her home. Jessica immediately called 911, and the 2-year-old was transported to Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters and was pronounced deceased. The pathologist who performed the autopsy on the 2-year-old later declared that she was potentially smothered, and that is how she passed away. They also saw that the child had blunt force injuries as well. Jessica was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter in August of 2022, and on March 17th of this year, she was sentenced to 10 years in prison.
A family in New Zealand found human remains inside of a storage locker they won through an auction. It's typical for storage units to be put up for auction if they have been unclaimed and unused for many years. This New Zealand family won a specific storage locker and they were emptying it out, found some suitcases. Upon realizing that the suitcases smelled terrible, they opened them up and found decomposing bodies. These bodies were later identified to be 2 children, one 5 years old and the other about 10 years old. While we don't know how long they were in the storage locker, it does seem like they had been there for a good amount of time. The only lead right now is police think that the children's mother is living in South Korea and she arrived there in 2018. Other than that, we don't really know much about this case yet.
Down for whatever. In the back of his mind is Coretta, and she knows.
Okay, so a lot of you guys hit me up about this, so I'm gonna explain what this video is. This video was dealing with the Chris Watts case. And if you don't know what that is, oh my goodness, you are in for a story. I'm doing this all in one part, so sit tight. Chris Watts was a normal man that was married to a woman named Shanann Watts. I've heard some people pronounce it Shannon, but it's spelled Shanann, so we'll just go with that for now. They had an extremely normal seeming relationship. Shanann had many friends, as did Chris, and they had 2 beautiful children, and actually Shanann was pregnant with another child. Everything seemed like roses and gumdrops in this relationship until one day. You see, Shanann had a scheduled doctor's appointment that she missed. And these are very important doctor's appointments because her friend was so worried that she missed this one that she literally called the police to the house because she thought something was wrong. Her friend's name was Nicole, by the way, and she is a huge reason why this case even got solved. So Nicole's at the house talking to the police, and she explained how her car was still in the garage, the shoes that she wears every day were still there, and just as she was talking to them, Chris pulled up to his house. Now Chris ran up and looked extremely worried at the time and then shook the police officer's hands and then went straight inside without making any eye contact with Nicole. Something real suspicious was going on. So anyway, the police officer took Chris into a closet to interrogate him. And Chris said this.
Nobody's hurt from nobody.
So of course the cop had to take all the information into account, and he was like, alright, cool, this is what Chris had to say about it, let's go back to her. And because Nicole acted so quickly and was so on top of things, Chris couldn't dispose of any of Shannon's personal items. She noticed her purse was still there, and the medication she was supposed to take every day was still there as well. And then they contacted a neighbor who had security cameras out front of his house. And what he was able to find was shocking. The security cameras captured Chris Watts backing his pickup truck to the front of his house, and then moments later, pulling out bags and throwing them into the back of the pickup truck. And when you watch the footage, you realize Chris knows he was caught. Upon reasonable suspicion, Chris was later arrested, and it came out that Chris had murdered his wife and 2 children. 3 children if you count the child that his wife was pregnant with. He had taken them to oil canisters that were around where he worked at and disposed of the bodies. But right now, Chris Watts is in prison, rotting away, serving 5 life sentences. Sure, this was someone that didn't know this story.
She must have been out of her head.
This is the most demonic case I have ever heard yet. In Woodstock, Illinois in 2009, Kyle Morgan lured a homeless man into his home, promising him food, shelter, and something to drink. A few weeks go by, and the maintenance of the apartment complex were called to the unit as there was a foul odor coming from it. The scene in the apartment was horrific, and police discovered the homeless man who had been struck multiple times. He also had 666 written on his forehead. On the walls in the apartment were satanic writings and the blood of the victim. Thankfully, Kyle was found a few states away. However, it was during a police chase, and he ended up hitting 2 people in the process. Surprisingly, he actually pleaded guilty. However, he claimed that he was mentally ill, so he only received 30 years in prison.
The Anthill Kids Cult, Part 5. This is one of the most gruesome parts, so big trigger warning. Even if you can handle these type of topics, you might be very, very disturbed. Hi, I'm Julie and I talk about true crime, dark history, and all things spooky, so if you like that, please follow me. So after the freezing baby incident, the authorities came and raided the place again in 1985 and took away all 14 children, thank God. Of course, this didn't stop them from having babies, so every time that they had a new baby, the authorities would have to come in and take them away again. Once the children were all gone, things spiraled completely out of control. Many of the cult members tried to escape, but none were ever successful. One of the members that tried to escape was actually Rock's second wife, Giselle. It was actually Giselle's idea to leave the baby out in the cold, But despite that, really bad things happened to this woman on the commune. Rock found out that Giselle was trying to escape the commune and then threw a hunting knife at her, which landed in her thigh and created a 3-inch deep wound. Rock's response to this was to have a beer and then take a nap, and then hours later wanted to operate on her leg. It had been so long since her initial injury at this point that her leg began to clot and swell. Rock pressed on her wound until it opened back up again, and then he proceeded to pour boiling hot water in her wound repeatedly. And then he filled the wound up with salt and olive oil. Somehow Giselle survived this surgery. He also blowtorched one of his wife's stomach while she was pregnant. One of his favorite things to do was blowtorch people. He even blowtorched one of his wives on her back until the skin was bubbling up. A man named Claude who lived on the commune received horrific treatment as well. Rock poured boiling hot water on him, pulled out 11 of his teeth with a pair of pliers, broke each of his toes by hand, and then sliced his arm open with a piece of glass. He got one of his wives to break Claude's leg with a sledgehammer. Claude was ordered to walk around with an elastic band wrapped tightly around his testicles. He had to keep the elastic band on overnight, and then one of his testicles swelled up to the size of an orange. This caused irreparable damage. Then of course Rock decided to operate on him the next morning. He removed one of Claude's testicles and cauterized the wound with a hot iron. The next surgery Rock performed caused another death. This is the hardest one to hear. A woman named Solange started to complain of stomach pain. Rock of course concludes that the best thing to do is operate. He laid Solange on the table and punched her in the stomach. He then forced a tube into her rectum to perform an enema with molasses and olive oil. I don't know what his thing with olive oil is. I'm sorry guys, you're gonna have to come back for part 6.
So now a neighbor in the brick building next door is stating that he got home at 1:30 and at 4 a.m. he heard a scream coming from the house where the 4 were slain in the Idaho murders. He thought that they were throwing a party, but now he realizes it probably was a scream for help. He didn't think anything of the scream and went back to sleep, but he did notice that a black SUV that he didn't recognize was parked in their driveway. I find it interesting that a whole building down the street heard a scream at the exact time that the murders were supposed to occur, but the roommates inside of the house said they heard nothing. What do you think? Do you think that's true? Do you think that they heard nothing? Do you think that it's interesting that a man down the street heard screams, but they didn't? Comment, let me know.
What is the scariest thing that could happen while camping? Well, this one guy who was camping in Florida had a horrifying encounter. And before we get into it, I have a podcast episode of 2 of the scariest camping stories I've ever heard if you're interested. So years ago, a guy and his friend were camping in Florida when they came upon this old man's campground. It was in disarray, so they kind of got a bad feeling from it and they turned to leave. But then the guy comes out of the campsite and is like, oh, hey, he wants to talk to them. He starts engaging them. He's giving them suggestions of where to go in the woods, but he's telling them where to go in steps, not in miles or yards. So he's like, oh, the waterfall is 300 steps from here. And one of the guys thinks that's weird because that's really not common in the area to describe where to go. A few months pass and they basically just forget about this interaction. But one day, one of the guys calls the other guy and is like, dude, you have to turn on the TV right now. And all over the news are pictures of this guy, the guy they saw, Gary Michael Hilton, who is a serial killer who preyed upon young women in national parks, kidnapping them and taking their lives. Some of the places he told the boys to go look at were places he had hid bodies. Both men were contacted by law enforcement and ended up giving very valuable information in the investigation.